Hey everybody, today we're going to look at Jayson Hopper and his competition history in a little bit of depth. To me, he's kind of one of the biggest unknowns in the sport, considering he has a top 10 games finish and back-to-back top 10 finishes at the Rogue Invitational to his name. For Jayson Hopper to finish so high in these competitions and to not really have a good understanding of what he excels at and what his weaknesses are. As we head into the Rogue Invitational, he is one of our qualifiers out of the queue. I wanted to dive in a little bit more over the past couple of years to see what type of events Hopper excels in and which ones give him trouble. So over the course of this, we're going to be taking a look at some of the reports we have on franlung.com that help us analyze athlete performance. So we're going to be taking a look at which time domains Jayson Hopper does best and worst in, what type of rep schemes, and a look at some movements that he excels at and give him trouble. So hopefully that gives us a little bit better picture of Jayson Hopper and what to expect going into Rogue Invitational, and to see how his progress of filling some of these gaps and improving as an athlete are heading into the 2024 season.
Taking a look at Jayson Hopper's performances over the course of the last couple years, obviously had that 31st at the CrossFit Games this year, had a second at North America East semifinals, and on a global leaderboard for semifinals that had him tied in second with Patrick Vellner. At the Rogue Invitational in the fall last year, he had a 7th place overall, had a 7th at the 2022 CrossFit Games as well. At the Syndicate Crown semifinal, he had a 2nd place, and then had an 11th place at Wodapalooza to kick off 2022. So all in all, over the past couple years, minus this hiccup at the CrossFit Games, has had a pretty impressive competition history. Let's start breaking down some event finishes and some different criteria to see where Jayson Hopper's strengths and weaknesses really lie. So the first chart we're going to take a look at takes a look at Jayson Hopper's average event finishes by time domains. So on the left-hand side, we see his average event finish in each competition. And then from there, we start to see how event finishes in the specific time domains relate to his overall finishes or average finishes in the competition. So the light green cells show an average finish slightly better than his overall average finish in a competition. The bright green shows a significantly better finish, while the light red is slightly less than average for his overall event finishes, and the dark red shows a significantly below. So looking at the average time domain finishes for Jayson Hopper, for the most part, the heavy events, those are going to be your max lifts, are roughly on average for his overall event finishes. Under 5 minutes, so those quick ones didn't do so well at the CrossFit Games this year. But again, for the most part, they're on average. On average, they are slightly above 5 to 10 minutes. There are a couple exceptions there at the Rogue Invitational in North America East, where we did have better event finishes there than his overall average competition. But again, for the most part, right in line with his average overall finish. Then when it gets interesting here is the 10 to 20 minute and the greater than 20 minute events. So with the exception of the 2023 CrossFit Games, this 10 to 20 minute time range really seems to be an Achilles heel holding him back. For majority of his competition history, we're seeing that his average event finishes in these 10 to 20 minute time domains are significantly lower than his overall average finishes in the competition. Completely opposite to that, though, is the greater than 20 minute events. There's the bike event at the 2023 CrossFit Games, which a lot of people didn't really perform the way they expected. But for the most part, these are general strengths for Jayson Hopper. In looking at some of the events, he had the Test 1 at North America East semifinals, which had all the machines and the sled pulls, and the ruck run at the 2022 Rogue Invitational, which he also won. Those types of events, really long, suffering events, they really seem to be playing to Jayson Hopper's strengths. Next up, we're going to take a look at average event finishes by rep scheme. On this one, there's really two types of workouts that stand out as positives and negatives for Jayson Hopper. On the plus side, looks like couplets are generally a strength for him in a top competition, while on the other hand, pyramid chippers really seem to be pulling him down as well. Certainly on the pyramid chippers, which is what we're going to dive into next, I think it's more generally around the type of programming that we see in these events and the specific movements that are general weaknesses for Hopper that end up being in these pyramid chippers, which generally makes it highlight here. But it is interesting to see on the positive side how the couplets and again the heavy events, the single modality movements, those ones end up pulling Jayson Hopper up on the leaderboard over the course of a competition. Next up, we're going to take a look at Jayson Hopper's best event finishes over the past couple years in his individual competitions. What I find interesting as we look into these, there's really four types of movements or workouts that really stand out as positives for Hopper. So first up, you got kind of your long suffering events. Events you just need to put your head down, endure, and get to the end. A lot of times they just end up being more mental than physical. Second type of event here is events that involve odd objects. So a lot of sandbags tend to show up in events that Hopper excels at. We got a couple max lifts in here, which we'll see. And then interesting enough, we have deficit handstand push-ups as being something that Jayson Hopper really excels at. So we'll start off with the 2023 CrossFit Games. So he was 11th in the pig chipper. This was one of the longer events. And again, just doing those pig flips, those odd objects. He was 14th in ski bag, which again had those sandbag squats, which you just needed to push through. At North America East semifinal, so we got four events that he excelled at here. You had test one, which was ultimately ended up being the hand over hand sled pull. Took first in that event. You also had a second in Linda, which again was one of those longer events and just again needed to push through the weight for the better part of 17 minutes. He also had a first in test 4, which was the 800 meter run, then the max snatch. And then test 7, he had a second in as well, which again, kind of a bit of a sufferfest with the Echo Bike cows toast to bar and then an odd object sandbag carry. Taking a look at the 2022 Rogue Invitational, Jayson Hopper ended up having 2 event wins here. First up was the Texas Trail Run, ended up being 4.2 mile run, some with a rucksack, and then in the middle of it you had some sandbag up and overs to just mix it up a little bit. And then the snatch and press event, which had some dumbbell snatches at 100 pounds and then some parallel at handstand push-ups. So again, it's interesting to see that the parallel at handstand push-ups end up being a strength, but they first come out in this event win for Hopper at last year's Rogue. At the 2022 CrossFit Games, 4 events to highlight. He had a 4th in shuttle to overhead B, which is basically the max jerks after the shuttle runs. So similar movement style to the deficit handstand push-ups with the jerks. He had a 5th place in a capital, which again had a whole bunch of odd object work and was a bit of a sufferfest and the longest event at the 2022 CrossFit Games. He had a 2nd in Echo Press, which was the Echo Bike and the deficit wall-facing handstand push-ups, and then had a 4th in the sandbag to shoulder. Ended up tying all the guys and finished above him. He just lost in the tie break there. So again, all those, you got the odd objects, you got the long events, you got the deficit handstand push-ups, all fitting into that same bucket of strengths for Hopper. At the 2022 Syndicate Crown, a couple events to highlight. So there's the Oregon Trail event. He took a 2nd place there. Again, long sufferfest, Echo Bike, tank push. And then King Kong, which had some more deficit handstand push-ups and some sandbag to shoulder. And then at 2022 Wadapalooza, he won the Echo Fran event, which was a take on Fran, just added some Echo Bike calories in there as well. So again, a real suffering event. Fran's not fun at the best of times, but you throw in some Echo Bike there, and you need to have some strong mental fitness to get through that one. After taking a look at his best event finishes, when we look at specific movements in those events, we can again see those trends even more clearly. When looking at odd object carries, certainly in the last couple years, well above average in terms of odd object event finishes in comparison to Jayson Hopper's average event finishes. When we look at handstand push-ups, in this chart we're seeing all handstand push-up events. And in this case, Jayson Hopper is basically the anti-Laura Horvath when it comes to handstand push-ups. When looking at the 2022 Rogue Invitational and the 22 CrossFit Games, we see these two events that stand out as being significantly better than Jayson Hopper's average event finishes for those competitions. Both those events, deficit handstand push-ups. These other four with the red highlighting that show a much worse finish than his average event finishes in those competitions, those are just standard handstand push-ups. So it's really interesting to see that for Hopper, the deficit is really the game changer for him. Now, as we switch the side of the equation and look at the weaknesses for Jayson Hopper, when we look at the past couple years of competition, his weaknesses in terms of movements really all fall into high skill gymnastics. So you got your handstand walks, you got bar muscle ups, you got ring muscle ups, and some rope climbs, all kind of end up in this weaknesses bucket for Jayson Hopper. So when we look at the 2023 CrossFit Games, started out with 33rd in a bike. Lots of people struggled with the bike. A lot of them, there's a lot of crashes that we don't ultimately know about. So going to kind of throw that one away in the analysis. But then you got 38th in the inverted medley, where we did see the handstand walk course with the pirouettes and some freestanding handstand push-ups. And then he also had a 37th in Helena, which had 3 rounds that included 12 bar muscle ups in each round. At the 2023 North America East semi-final, he had 11th in Test 2, which for him in that competition was among his worst events, but that had all those ring muscle-up complexes. He had a 12th in Test 5, but he just came off of winning Test 4 in that 305-pound snatch, so could have been a little bit fatigued to do more snatches and then an 800-meter sprint. So again, kind of going to ignore that one since it is a bit of an anomaly. Then he also had a 12th in Test 6, which had the more handstand walks and some seated legless rope climbs, just to make things a little bit more intense for the gymnastics portion of that competition. At the 2022 Rogue Invitational, really 4 events fell into the weakness bucket for him. So first up, he had his 19th in ski bar, which was his worst event of the competition. That had some 40 bar muscle ups. You had back attack, which had some really heavy back squats. We haven't seen back squats 4 reps at 405 pounds. So really kind of just a unique event in itself. So again, kind of going to put that in an anomaly bucket since it hasn't seen anything like this in competition history before. You had the Dual 2, which had legless rope climbs. And then there's the Goblet, which had 49 ring muscle ups over the course of that event. At the 2022 CrossFit Games, you had the Speedy Skill Medley, which had pegboards, the single unders, pistols, and handstand walks, which was that elimination style event. Finished 28th in that event. Had the handstand walk, of course. I thought pegboards might also be a weakness for him since they do kind of have that gymnastics upper body pulling similar to rope climbs, but he finished just fine at the 2021 CrossFit Games in that pegboard event. So really it would just kind of highlight this one, A, to the structure of the event, and to the handstand walk obstacles. There was a 29th at Elizabeth Elevated, which is where we saw the parallel bar traverses for the first time. So again, unique there, but it is that high skill gymnastics. And then he had a 30th in up and over as well, which had 3 rounds, with ring muscle ups in each round. Moving on to the 2022 Syndicate Crown semifinal. Only really had one bad event of that competition, a 12th in the 2014 IE Regional, which had our 10 legless rope climbs. And then at 2022 Wadapalooza, a couple of the weaker events for him, at 25th in the Bayside Chipper, which interesting enough is that pyramid style chipper that we talked about earlier, but smack dab in the middle of it you had your 8 rope climbs. And then a 24th in Celebrate 10, which had just some basic handstand push-ups, but then 5 rounds of 5 ring muscle-ups. So again, those ring muscle-ups appearing in an event that was a weakness for Jayson Hopper at Wadapalooza. When we break down Jayson Hopper's individual event finishes for specific movements, these weaknesses, again, they really stand out. So first up, we look at the handstand walk average. Everything is below what his average event finish for those competitions are. Same bar muscle ups, stands out quite clearly, the weakness there. Similar, again, ring muscle ups, a lot of red, a lot of below average finishes for Jayson Hopper in ring muscle up events. And then rope climbs, there were a few that stood out as positives, but again, overall, for the most part, rope climbs, again, another weakness that holds Jayson Hopper back from kind of hitting his stride and hitting the top of the podium.
And that is Jayson Hopper, the athlete. We're going to be continuing this Who Is series over the course of the off season here. So let us know in the comments who you want to see next. If there's any movements or time domains that you have a hunch a athlete excels at, let us know here or on Instagram. So with that, thanks for listening. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.